So which bugs and bioforms are the strongest of the higher fleets, and which are sadly lacking in 10th edition? Let's talk through a tier list of Tyranid units and what makes them all strong or weak for the points. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're doing a Tyranids tier list, which I've been reliably informed by the comments is properly called a Tyranid list every other time I've made this on the channel. In this video, we're going to talk through the entirety of the Tyranids index, every single unit with its points cost, with a few thoughts as to how well it's stacking up against the other bugs that are on offer. I do think there's plenty of units that are looking generally overcosted for their points cost, and there's some that are looking outright outstanding. This tier list is largely based on a vote by Tyranids players as to which units they considered either strong or weak, plus just a little bit of my own discretion with where to draw the lines, or for a couple of units that I think really have been slightly misclassified that have been bumped up or down a little. For this video, I've ranked the Tyranids units into 5 tiers. Let's talk through all the units in order, starting with the weakest and ending with the strongest, how many points they cost, and what they can bring for you on the table. First up, let's start with Tier 5, perhaps some of the weakest or most overshadowed units in the Codex. Ones I'd be kind of surprised to see in most competitive lists going forward, though I do feel like the Rippers might be a little bit undervalued here, even if they don't exactly do much damage. First up, we've got the Tyranid Warriors with the melee bioweapons. These are either 80 points for 3 or 180 for 6. Honestly, the points cost of these guys just seemed kind of strange when they first came out. I'm honestly not sure why they're so much crazily more expensive than the mixed Tyranid Warriors with both range and melee, which at least seem on paper to be kind of similar utility. Sure, you trade out a little bit of combat hitting power, but you get some nice things like free venom cannons, and of course some ranged threats with their small arms. 30 points just isn't really all that exciting for these, particularly compared with all the competition. Tyranids aren't really struggling too much for anti-infantry damage, and these guys bring 6 attacks at strength 5, AP 2 and damage 1 to the table. It's just not really all that exciting for a unit that isn't enormously fast or enormously tough, plus seems to be just directly outcompeted by the other datasheets, I think. Another really quite underwhelming unit in the Codex, I think, is the Winged Prime. 80 points for this guy, and despite putting in a starry appearance in that animated reveal trailer, he just maybe doesn't do an awful lot for his points cost. His melee for a character is just a touch on the underwhelming side at strength 6, AP 1 and damage 2, even if he does get 6 attacks, and while he gives a helpful boost of sustained hits to his units, it just feels like he doesn't really have any enormously useful units to lead. The Tyranid warriors will be moving far slower than he could, and the gargoyles just don't really seem worth buffing the damage output of the flesh borers all that much. Overall, I feel like his datasheet would just need to be a little bit costed less if people wanted to take him with any sort of regularity. Next up, we've got the Spore Mines and the Mucilid Spore, both costed surprisingly highly for what they do. Spore Mines are 50 points or 100 points for 3 to 6, and the Mucilids are 45 or 90 for just 1 to 2. Spore Mines and the Mucilids can be useful if they're on the table. They stop enemies doing advanced moves within 6 inches of them, which is kind of nice, and can do a little bit of area denial mortal wound threat, but in general, even if the enemy moves right up to them, then they're not really going to do enough to justify the points cost in terms of direct damage. I can't really see anyone wanting to buy these in just on the points cost that they are. You're far better off spawning them out of units of Biovores, which can get them onto the table where they need to be turn 1, as well as having the option of swapping out for range damage if that makes more sense. The Spore Assist also doesn't seem to be terribly exciting for 145 points. It's an immobile organism that sits in your deployment zone, and when your opponent moves within 24 inches of it, it gets to take a pot shot at you with its bioweapons, all while chucking out Mucilids each turn. Realistically, I don't think it's completely unusable. Against the right army, it could be kind of annoying to have to take the damage from it if you're moving forward, but strength 5 and damage 2 on a slightly inaccurate gun really isn't going to trouble a bunch of armies out there. And for a fortification style Tyranid, it's just not really all that tough. A lot easier to kill than just about any of the other monstrous creatures for 145 points. Again, just seems to be a bit overcosted for what it does, even if its rules are pretty interesting. Finally, for the lowest tier, we've got Rippers, which I think I could have been persuaded to put up to a higher tier, to be honest. Despite having objective control 0, I still think they're kind of interesting, just because they're so cheap and rather annoying to remove from the table. 35 points or 70 for a unit of 3 or 6, and they're basically little Tyranid annoyance and interference screening units for 4 wounds at toughness 2, with almost no melee or range damage, with a bunch of very weak attacks hitting on ballistic skill or weapon skill 5. They don't get any objective control, so they can't actually take points, but they do have a few other interesting things. They are at least a relatively tanky unit for the points cost that can deep strike, and that's interesting enough for screening out the enemy. But I feel like for little cheap annoyance units, they could be kind of interesting to have 1 or 2 units in your army just to do things like a bit of screening or secondary objectives, which tend not to care about the objective control stat. I feel like perhaps they have a little bit more utility than they're really being given here, but I'll keep them in tier 5 for now, seeing as they were voted the single worst unit by you guys. Very much a unit that has value mainly because they just exist and get in the way, as opposed to doing anything particularly useful. I guess Tyranids do have a bit of competition for cheap nuisance units. You could field 11 Eurogaunts for 45 points, or individual Pyrovores for 30, both of which have their advantages. Moving on, we've got the tier 4 choices. These generally voted a fair bit below the majority of Tyranid units, maybe getting to be a little bit more usable than the stuff in the bottom tier, but still units with issues or compare badly. The Tyranid Flyers are 170 points for the Harpy or 200 for the Hive Crone. They come with Games Workshop's aircraft issues. Either they have to be in hover mode, or they have to turn up turn 2 and get locked flight paths. I guess you'd normally choose the former, I think. I'm just not sure they really have enough quality shooting to justify them turning up turn 2. Compared with the previous edition's datasheets, the twin-linked guns have really hurt the Harpy. Its bombs are still fairly serious, I suppose, but you're either not going to be bombing until turn 3, or you're going to have to move just 20 inches, not a really big movement that it had before, so you are going to have fewer targets. The Hive Chrome maybe has a little bit more direct shooting, but also comes with a heftier points tag. Overall, I just feel like the damage and defense of these just isn't very exciting for how many points you pay. Next up, we've got the big Forge World Tyranids, the Barbed-Scythe Hierodules, and the Harridan and Hierophant. The Hierodules are both 305 points, and then the Hierophant is 810, the Harridan 655. In general, I feel like these guys aren't unplayable. They do have big, hefty defensive stat lines, but just probably aren't going to be quite as efficient as fielding a lot of smaller Tyranid monsters, not when they're being compared to things like Tyrannofexes or Haruspex or Exocrines. For the price of a Barbed or Scythed Hierodule, you could get a Tyrannofex for decent range and very tough defense, plus almost an entire Haruspex for combat as well. I feel like it's just making them into slightly more overshadowed monsters, and they don't really do anything enormously unique. The other two are really going to dominate an army and take up a huge chunk of your points cost. Feels like you'd be playing a very different game if you were building around those, though they definitely seem like they're playable enough. Decent generalist damage output with dire biocannons and the bioplasma from the Hierophant, plus it's got fairly meaty defensive stats with toughness 14 and 30 wounds. Still though kind of hard to use just with the enormous profiles of these things and fitting around terrain, and you're probably just better off with the same points cost in smaller monsters. Otherwise, a little bit more on the underwhelming side as well are the Toxicrin at 200 points, and perhaps the Turvagon. The Toxicrin is just very anti-infantry focus, lots of strength 6, AP -1 and damage 2 attacks. Again, just maybe not really what Tyranids are massively lacking for, lots of things have that profile. Plus it's kind of short ranged as well and isn't really going to have the biggest choice of what it contacts, it's just going to have to try and deal with whatever the enemy throws at it, whether or not it's a vehicle or infantry or a mounted unit. Even if it does obliterate infantry fairly well, it's just quite a lot for 200 points when it could be fighting something very suboptimal. It does also have a few bits of mortal wound chance and the chance to prevent fallback as well, which are both interesting, but perhaps a little situational. Finally, we've got the Turvagon for 200 points. This thing has lost a few big advantages that it had in 9th edition maybe. It only respawns D3 plus 3 gaunts to a unit each turn now, and while you can still stack that with both the Turvagon and the Stratagem, it's maybe a little bit less meaningful on the gaunts, seeing as you can't stack their defense quite so high, casting things like Catalyst or giving them other defensive boosts. The Turvagon also doesn't come preloaded with a Brood anymore, so if it's your turn first it won't be doing much. And it can also be attacked directly as well, no longer hiding behind the Termagant Brood, so if your opponent really wants it dead, they can focus a bunch of anti-tank on it. Perhaps makes it just a little bit less effective for really hoardy armies where you want to spam loads of infantry, and this might be one of the few heavy targets. Still definitely not useless though. Respawning a whole load of gaunts in addition to the Endless Swarm stratagem is still very nice. It grants lethal hits to a Termagant squad, and though it can't hide, it's still got okay toughness and brings a bit of its own close range threat too, but overall perhaps not quite as intimidating as it might have been in 9th maybe. Maybe not too far behind though, I perhaps could have been persuaded to put this one up into tier 3. Talking of which, let's move on to the third tier of Tyranids. This one's the biggest one, and units that are ranked kind of mid-strength. Solid usable units that I would expect people to field in plenty of armies, but perhaps not really the most exciting units in the codex, or the ones that are most efficient for their points cost. Perhaps out of these ones, one of the very best of them might be the Venomthropes, which I'd say would be towards tier 2. As they were before, they remain a pretty helpful thing to have somewhere in the Tyranid battle line, perhaps just one unit of them to give out stealth and the benefit of cover to infantry, or just the benefit of cover to monsters. Really quite handy to have somewhere in the battle line, in the core of your forces, to make a lot of your units a bit harder to kill. Perhaps just a tiny bit less valuable to monsters though, given how easy it is to generally get a cover save in 40k 10th edition anyway. To infantry though, they do seem very nice. A -1 to hit with stealth is helpful. Next up, we've got the Trigon and the Morlock, the Terrors from the Deep, 180 for the Trigon and 145 for the Morlock. The Trigon's fairly expensive, but does hit with plenty of damage 3 attacks, fairly impressive to get a full 12 of them, and the Morlock gives its mortal wound damage when it appears in enemy lines, and then when it charges in, it does a whole load of strength 8, AP 2 and damage 1 attacks, really quite brutal against infantry, but less good against other things. I feel like both of these are kind of balanced, really. The Trigon does have its other fun special rule to turn up dead close to the enemy, though it does stop you from charging that same turn. Still could put the Trigon somewhere really annoying though, and somewhere that's hard to deal with for your foe. The new Psychophage from the Leviathan box is 125 points. This one's definitely a monster that's skewed a lot more towards durability as opposed to damage. Pretty tough for the cost with its 5+ Feel No Pain type save, and also gives an aura of Feel No Pain to nearby Tyranids, and for that reason it could be kind of interesting to have in a Monster Mash battle line perhaps. Overall, if it's supporting multiple other units, it seems fairly reasonable to include, though it does have kind of mediocre damage for itself unless it happens to be able to get into Psychers, in which case it can bring a fair few mortal wounds. The Maliceptor's 165 points for a reasonably tanky Tyranid monster with a 4+ invulnerable save. It doesn't belt out quite as many mortal wounds as it did in 10th edition, instead having a fairly general purpose damage 3 shooting attack at 18 inches and kind of okay melee with some massive claws. A special rule is to debuff the enemy units up close, though on a slowish monster that feels like a bit more of an opportunistic rule than one that's going to come up all the time. Doesn't seem too bad to have on the front lines though, at least those debuffs will work when it gets charged. I feel like it has fairly solid competition for the Exocrine though that gets a similar sort of damage output at longer range. The new and dangerous Screamer Killer is 180 points, which I think is maybe a little bit higher than the people were hoping for on the points cost for this guy. He does have really quite threatening melee, again with a whole bunch of damage 3 attacks, and he backs that up with a Psychic Scream for a bunch of damage 1, and also battle shocking the enemy with a -1 debuff. Overall, I'd say his damage is fairly impressive for the points cost, but his defensive profile isn't really all that great. Even with a 2+ save, toughness 9 is going to get focused at least fairly easily by anti-tank guns, and he's perhaps got a bit more chance than most of not making his target, as the enemy's going to treat him as a high priority threat that's not too hard to take out. Still very scary if you can deliver him though. The Winged Hive Tyrant maybe isn't quite so universally terrifying as it was in 9th maybe, 195 points, and still fairly fast and dangerous with either a big gun or a melee weapon. As with the on-foot Hive Tyrant, he can hand out some free stratagems, and also debuffs enemies with Paroxysm. His main issue though is that he's not really all that tough, and unless you hide him behind line of sight blocking terrain, he can just be directly shot off the table. The 4+ invulnerable save does help a bit with that, but still I'd say he's at least reasonably fragile for the cost comparatively. The flight keyword isn't quite as overwhelming on monsters these days as well, given the changes to how it works with terrain, and overall I can see why people are a bit more tempted by the Foot Tyrant or the Swarm Lord, which maybe bring a bit more general damage threat and also can be hidden behind Tyrant Guard. Next up we've got the Tyranid Swarms, the Termagants, Gargoyles, Hormagaunts and Neurogaunts, all of which I think are at least reasonably well balanced. Units that you could definitely include a few units of in your army, but probably aren't ones to go absolutely wild with unless you're building some sort of massive infantry skew list, as certain things like blast weapons tend to kill them really quite easily, plus none of them really have all that great damage output for the cost in my opinion. The biggest advantages, I think, are good numbers that certain units will struggle to deal with, and quite a lot of objective control points, and you can respawn depleted units with that Endless Multitude strat. If your opponent does make the mistake of leaving multiple units alive, 1 command point for an average of 10 gaunts respawned is very impressive. Going through the list, Termagants are 60 points, really not too bad with their reactive movement to scoot away from enemies, and a little bit of fairly effective anti-infantry shooting. The reactive movement occasionally could be really quite big if it say prevents an enemy charge. Gargoyles are 75 points for 10 or 150 for 20. They're fast moving objective control 2 and get deep strike innately, plus their move shoot move ability, which is rather fun to duck in and out of terrain if they need to, or just go even faster. They perhaps feel like the single most interesting one out of them, even if they cost the most. Hormagaunts can get to the front lightning fast, 70 points for a 10-inch move, and plus the ability to advance and charge as well. In combat though, their damage isn't super exciting, unless you're running them in big numbers, or you're fighting against light infantry. Strength 3 and AP -1 hitting on 4s doesn't really get you all that far. Finally, Neurogaunts are perhaps in a similar sort of place to the Rippers, 45 points for a unit that just is a whole bunch of wounds, and in general doesn't really do all that much. It does technically broadcast synapse through it, which helps a bit, but maybe isn't quite as exciting as the other units. Compared with Rippers though, they do give you really quite a lot of objective control points, 1 point each, and even the base unit comes with 11 models, not 10. They might not do any real damage, but just for an annoying unit to get in the way and bog down the enemy, they seem pretty excellent at that, screening out sections of the board, and they're rarely going to be a unit that the opponent really wants to shoot or charge. In theory, they could also function as a bunch of ablative wounds for a Neurotyrant as well. That does have positives in that you need to slog through an entire swarm before he gets to the big bug, but it does risk your Neurotyrant taking a whole load of damage from small arms, as if it has to start making saves within the same shooting attack, then anything that wounded the toughness 3 profile of the Gaunts will also have wounded the Neurotyrant. Overall, as I mentioned, I feel like they're all at least reasonably well balanced. I probably wouldn't be too tempted to spam any one of them to any great extent, though if you did want to play Horde Tyranids and just flood all the objectives with excessive bodies, you certainly could do. Next up, we've got the Gene Stealers with their new Scout move and 2 wound profile, 90 points or 180 for a squad of 5 or 10. Their main role seems to be to tear enemy infantry away from objectives, a whole bunch of strength 4 AP2 attacks that get 4 wound rerolls when they target an enemy sitting on a point. For mid-board control, they're probably competing with things like the very good Von Ryan's Leapers, Lictors and Death Leaper. I feel like most people might be a bit more tempted to take those rather than the Gene Stealers, but at least 2 wounds makes them a little bit less fragile now. Pyrovores can be fielded as cheap little disruption units for 30 points each. Their flamethrower gets d6 plus 1, strength 6 and AP 1, damage 1 attacks. Not too bad for burning through a few hordes, though maybe a little bit hard to deliver given close range and slow movement. Perhaps one of the most interesting things is they're just really quite cheap little individual units for just 30 points. Could be interesting enough just to sit on a very safe objective or screen the opponent out of certain areas of the board. And I guess in 10th edition, the Overwatch that they have could be at least fairly scary. You also get a special rule to burn enemies from cover. If you're about to attack one unit that's within Pyrovore range, then you could maybe burn them with the Pyrovore first, and then remove cover from them for the rest of your army shooting them, which seems like it could be pretty decent value as well. Again, I'd say perhaps an interesting disruptive unit to just have 1 or 2 of, perhaps 30 points that the opponent has to be a bit more wary of than they really want to be. Next up, we've got the Raveners for either 75 or 150 points. These guys are cheapish, fast warriors with a whole bunch of damage 1 twin linked attacks. They get slightly less objective control than the regular Tyranid warriors, but get to deep strike and return to deep strike from strategic reserve if they really want to. I think for 75 points or 150 for a squad of 6, they pretty much just flat out outcompete the warriors with melee bio weapons. Not a bad annoyance unit to be a threat to enemy hordes, I suppose, and could potentially bully some smaller marine units. Again, not very general purpose and skews to anti-infantry like a fair few Tyranid things. They might also compare a little bit poorly with things like Von Ryan's Leapers that can start in the midfield, and also bring a similar sort of attack profile with the advantage of fighting first too. The Hive Guard have come down in points quite a lot since 9th edition. They're 100 points for 3 or 200 for 6. In general, a unit skewed to a lot more durability than they are actual damage. 4 wounds with toughness 7 and a 3+ save that you could easily get cover in seems very nice for just 33 points basically. For their damage, they either get a bit of indirect fire threat with those Impaler cannons, though it's only strength 5 AP1, or a bit of dedicated anti-vehicle with the shock cannons, a reasonable chance to get some mortal wounds out of them there. I guess handy enough if you know that you're almost certain to face vehicles with loads of them in the meta, I suppose. And they do also have the potential for some fairly efficient 4+ Overwatch for them, though I guess that would compete against other units with big auto-hitting weapons, maybe Tyrannofexes with an acid spray perhaps. Overall not awful against the right targets, but their damage output does seem to be a bit lacking really. Next up, we've got the ranged warriors that can take some venom cannons and some other guns into their profile, and still have at least a reasonable threat in melee with a bunch of damage 1 attacks as well. As they're 40 points less for a unit of 6 compared with the melee bioweapon warriors, I feel like they solidly outcompete those. Though without damage 2 melee and far fewer buffs than you could have got in 9th edition, I feel like these guys are a bit more on the sidelines now. Not too bad generalists to skirmish over midfield objectives though with their anti-infantry stats, plus they can bring a bit of synapse if that's needed. The Tyrannocyte is the Tyranid drop pod for 105 points. I'd say probably on the lower end of tier 3 for the points cost, but still interesting enough in that you could be deep striking a big Tyranid unit turn 1, getting a whole bunch of termagants all over an objective maybe, or getting a bunch of close range shooting to strike the enemy turn 1. I guess you could even do an aggressive zone throat drop if you wanted to and fire out a bunch of those warp blast shots, and then from there the pod's just a floating annoyance unit. Will be pretty irritating just to do a whole bunch of nuisance charges on nearby enemies, and can actually be somewhat of a threat to infantry with a fair amount of damage to attacks at range and melee. Next up, we've got the Broodlord at 100 points. This guy's a Genestealer leader with some fairly efficient anti-marine melee, a whole bunch of AP -2 and damage 2, re-rolling wounds with devastating wounds, and he also gives devastating wounds to the Genestealers as well, which is kind of nice with their full wound re-rolls when they're on objectives. Means they could punch up fairly hard against targets there. I feel like his damage stats and what he gives to the Genestealers is pretty interesting, though I do feel like you pay a bit of a premium for him at 100 points. I can't help but think a lot of the time if he's ranging ahead of the army with the Genestealers, they're going to hit on that enemy unit fairly hard and then just get removed with enemy firepower without too much effort. Still interesting enough in the early game, and Genestealers are a bit harder to take out than they were with toughness 4, a 5+ invulnerable, and the 2 wounds. But even so, 280 points for a unit of 10 of them plus this guy does seem like a bit of an ask. Finally, and I'd say probably towards the lower end of tier 3, we've got the Parasite and Mortrex. This guy's 90 points, and he runs around as a Tyranid lone operative unit that's just a bit of a nuisance. Ideally, it wants to pick on some 1-wound infantry if it can, kill a bunch of them with its regular attacks, and spawn some rippers from that barbed ovipositor. I feel like the lone operative keyword is really quite nice for it, though I think it's probably a bit pricey for what it brings realistically. I think it does lose a big advantage compared with 9th edition when it could move 16 inches. Its 12-inch movement just isn't quite as massively threatening as it was. Getting onto the really good stuff now though, and here in tier 2 we've got the stronger Tyranids units. Units that I wouldn't be too surprised to see as fairly common competitive Tyranid includes, solid things to have on the battle line, and there's only a few of them that I've selected to be ranked a bit higher than this. First up, we've got Old One Eye and the Carnifexes. Old One Eye is the leader Carnifex for 140 points. He can join a Carnifex squad and basically gives them anti-everything melee with his enormous talons and claws. Regenerates wounds a little and has a nice tough 5+ feel no pain, so is tougher than the majority of them. But perhaps most importantly, allows his lead units to re-roll the hit roll whenever they're attacking, both with ranged and melee weapons. If you are using Carnifexes, seems kind of tempting to throw him into the deal. Seems like a solid upgrade on the regular Carnifex for 15 points, just with the feel no pain and the big melee, never mind all the hit re-rolls. The regular Carnifexes are 125 points or 250, and you can have 1 or 2 of them. Reasonably tanky defense that isn't really too far behind the Screamer killers despite costing loads less. They are a fair bit less dangerous, and particularly because they only hit on a 4+ normally, but Old One Eye can certainly help with that, giving them some solidly accurate heavy venom cannon fire or something, plus dangerous melee with his included. I feel like these guys fielded as a trio seems a fairly threatening force to move up the board with, 390 points for some very dangerous melee monsters. Next up, we've got the Hive Tyrant and the Swarm Lord. 220 for the Hive Tyrant or 250 for the Swarm Lord. Both of them really quite interesting leaders for the army. Ideally want to be in a unit of Tyrant Guard, I think, as otherwise they'll be a bit too fragile for that points cost. For what they do individually, the Hive Tyrant will have some solid melee but also a big gun to fire at from behind the Tyrant Guard's protection. His main boost is that a nearby Tyranid unit can use a 0 CP stratagem per turn. Really quite a big power boost there for leadership abilities. Lots of strong options with the stratagems on offer in 10th. His onslaught rule also allows you to advance and shoot with all the guns nearby. That's really nice to have in the centre of a Tyranid swarm, particularly anything with both ranged and melee weapons wanting to get towards the front line. He in particular would quite like that, but seems nice enough for basically any other ranged monsters about, just getting range or line of sight. Otherwise, the Swarm Lord is basically Lord of the command points this edition. He generates 1 command point per battle round that he's on the board. That's a really big advantage just in itself, and he could spend that on units that aren't even directly close to him. And he also has one of those rules where he basically ruins one opposing stratagem after it's been used once, increasing the command point by an extra 1 to the rest of the game. That could be used on core things like Overwatch or the command point reroll, or any other super useful stratagem that the opposing army has. There's also just a powerful generalist melee combatant as well with Twin Links damage 3 bone sabers, able to tangle pretty nicely with both elite infantry and heavy stuff. I feel like either of those is pretty tempting to run up the board shielded by some Tyrant Guard. I think having both might be getting into slightly overkill territory, though you certainly have a whole bunch of stratagems to play with. Speaking of which, Tyrant Guard just seem kind of mandatory to keep the Tyrant safe. They've got a solid toughness 8 defense, and they can contribute to combat a fair bit. Really quite tanky ablative wounds, and means that the Tyrant's got some backup when he gets into combat too. Perhaps not super exciting, but definitely good value for the points in their protection and their extra bit of melee. The Tyrannifex seems like a really strong redoubtable ranged Tyranid bug. 200 points for this guy, but I think he does justify his price tag. Really quite massive defense with 16 wounds, a 2+ armor save and high toughness, and how he also gets a built-in -1 damage built into that as well, so he's far tougher than he perhaps should be against things like damage 2 and damage 3 weapons. Definitely feels like a monster that can take a punch and is fairly nice to have front and central in the army. He also has objective control 5, which is pretty helpful to stand on the midfield points. For his weapons, the acid spray does seem rather nice in the age of Overwatch, an average of around about 9 or 10 hits at 18-inch range at strength 6, AP 2 and damage 2. That could potentially be killing entire squads in the enemy turn with a CP. Though that rupture cannon is very swingy but enormously scary to any heavy hitter on the board, strength 18, AP 4 and a big damage 2d6 and 2 shots with heavy as well. Overall just seems like really quite solid raw muscle for the points cost, very capable of just taking damage and dealing out mass damage in return to his chosen target. The Exocrine did get toned down a little bit from 9th edition to 10th edition, but it also got an enormous points cut down to 135 points. For that fairly cheap points cost, you get some pretty reliable strength 8, AP 3 and damage 3 fire. Very nice for lighting up medium infantry and will chip in against tanks as well. He just seems all around efficient for 135 points. Solid attack, solid defense, and he also gets a special rule as well that buffs other Tyranid shooting when it targets the same unit as he did. Overall, just another very solid bug to have in the gun line, easily justifiable by his raw damage and defense alone. Next up, we've got the generally useful 4 deployment organisms, the Lictor, Death Leaper, and Von Ryan's Leapers. All of these I think are very well costed for what they do. 75 points for some 4 deployment screening, and some really quite nasty melee threat that also has Fight First. The Lictor and Death Leaper are very nearly the same units, but just trading out a couple of unit abilities. These guys forward deploy, get Stealth and Lone Operative to keep them safe, and aren't too bad on the defensive front either with 6 wounds, toughness 6 and a 5+ invulnerable save. It will give them at least a fair chance of surviving even against a squad's firepower shot at them. If they get the jump on enemy infantry units, there's a good chance of killing a bunch of them. 6 attacks hitting on 2s at strength 7, AP 2 and damage 2 with precision is nice and generalist, and you might even be able to snipe a character out of the unit if you get your hands on one. They generate command points if you do manage to kill a character. They fight first, which means that killing them in melee is kind of a risk and they're likely to deal at least some damage when they go down. And then depending on whether you choose the standard Lictors or the Death Leaper, they either get free pheromone trails for a 0 CP rapid ingress, which will be another way that you could use them should you want to, or Death Leaper actually has a way to hand out some actually fairly useful battle shock tests. If you get them close to an enemy unit, they have to test at -1 if they've taken any casualties or any damage at all. I feel like it's far more useful to have opponents actually fail in their own command phase compared with other times in turns, as that gives you a bit more chance of actually denying them scoring. Overall, both of these seem pretty great to start in the midfield as just general annoyance things that the opponent can't really ignore that well. They definitely have the potential to give advancing enemy units some serious issues. Potentially either competing against them or supporting them in the midfield, we've also got the Von Ryan's Leapers as well. These ones are a bit more of a standard squad, though still get stealth, either 75 points for 3 of them or 150 for 6. They get a fair few of the same advantages, but also bring a few more wounds to the table than a Lictor or Death Leaper. Their damage is a bit more skewed to 1 wound infantry as opposed to 2 wound infantry, though still are going to be at least fairly scary against most things with their flurry of attacks. 6 attacks per guy, even if they are only strength 5 and AP -1, is fairly impressive. Finally, for the tier 2 Tyranid units, we've also got the Neurotyrant here. This new and very cool looking Tyranid from the Leviathan box is quite a lot cheaper than I might have guessed at 105 points. Admittedly, he doesn't do the most vast amount of things on the board. He's got a 2d6 damage 2 Psychic Flamer, which is useful enough, not terrible for 105 points. He's got some buffs in Apps range, which helps out a bit, but perhaps one of his main things is making the Tyranid faction ability Shadow in the Warp a lot more dangerous. This one gives a -1 to the leadership test that it causes army-wide for the opponent if you have one Neurotyrant on the board. Battle Shock might matter a bit more or less against certain opponents, but if your opponent had, say, something like 15 units on the board, there's a reasonable chance that the Neurotyrants might make the difference between an extra 2 or 3 of them failing, which I think is kind of meaningful just in itself, even if it is just for one turn. I feel like between that and what he actually does on the board, it's not really too bad as an all-round proposition, and he could potentially give him a bodyguard of either the Neurogaunts or even some Tyrant Guard. Both of them perhaps have some pros and cons. The Tyrant Guard perhaps seem interesting enough though for being pretty tough and giving him toughness 8 as well, and he does have a way of making them a bit more dangerous against battle-shocked enemies. Finally though, we perhaps get into the really good stuff, Tier 1 and perhaps some of the top tier Tyranids around. I would expect to see quite a lot of these in competitive armies. First up, and just bringing some of the best damage and defense that the Tyranids have, are the Zoanthropes. These guys are perhaps just surprisingly cheap at 90 points for 3 or 180 for 6 of them. Very sturdy defense with toughness 5, 3 wounds, and a 4 plus invulnerable save, and then general purpose range damage either with basically mini las cannon shots with lethal hits, or a general purpose strength 7 AP2 and damage D3 blast shot, which is going to be a lot more effective if your opponent has some units that are ranked up a bit and the blast rule can come into force big. They also provide synapse and also grant a 6 plus invulnerable save bubble to nearby Tyranids, though admittedly that might be a bit more use to certain units than others. Definitely a lot more helpful for things with lower saves. Overall, they just seem like pretty fantastic value for the 90 points that they have. Wouldn't be surprised to see a fair few of these used as somewhat mainline damage dealers. Seems like a very scary unit that's at least somewhat hard to kill, and doesn't really care too much about what it's going to be shooting. They'll happily fire las cannon equivalents at things like Imperial Knights, or blast away at marine equivalents or hordes with the blast shots. Next up, and also just bringing the raw stats to the table for a surprisingly low cost, is the Auspex. This one does seem kind of weird, as it's just hard to see how people could have thought that this was balanced against the other Tyranid monsters. It is a ground-bound beast that's locked to pure melee pretty much, but both its defensive stats are kind of enormous, and certainly its melee is far more than I might have expected. For 125 points, toughness 11, a 3 plus save, and 14 wounds is pretty immense. That's going to take far more anti-tank firepower to bring it down than it's really worth, but if it does get into melee, then it gets perhaps a phenomenal amount of attacks really. 14 attacks with its tongue attacks at strength 7, AP minus 1 and damage 2 to just obliterate most hordes. And then strangely enough it also gets extra attacks with 4 extra strength 14, AP 2 and damage d6 plus 1 attacks. Means that in the same combat you can both be massively efficient against hordes and against heavies. It's just overall enormously bad news for anything that it touches. I do kind of wonder if someone might have made a mistake with the Haraspex's datasheet for these stats, to be honest. The limb and the tongue attacks sort of feel like they might be intended to be a sweep and strike mode for the Haraspex, but it just gets both due to the extra attacks rule. Whatever has happened though, this one just seems to be by far the most efficient Tyranid monstrous creature out of any of them. Huge combat damage, huge defense, and it even gets a couple of extras with a fun sniping tongue attack to try and pick out a character with that, plus some battle shock in combat as well, which doesn't hurt. Wouldn't be too surprised to see a trio of these in quite a lot of Tyranid competitive lists until anything changes. Seems like units that you can just throw towards the enemy and they're going to have to deal with them, or face the consequences of these great devourers. Next up, and perhaps one of the units that I think you could argue is maybe one of the most broken for Tyranids, is the Barbgaunts. These guys would have been very powerful even if they'd cost significantly more points than this, and it's pretty disturbing to be able to slow an entire infantry army with just a unit or two of these. But at 50 points they actually have genuinely great damage output against infantry just in themselves, never mind their fairly godly special rule. For just a tiny 50 point investment, these guys get 5d6 shots with a strength 5 AP0 biocannon, hitting on a 3 plus if static, the blast keyword chipping in yet more damage against hordes. For the points cost, that's just phenomenal damage. Against a fair few medium or lighter infantry targets, they could easily make their points back in a single round of shooting, never mind if they live to fire again. Their defense is also fairly good for 10 points I think. 2 wounds at toughness 4 isn't massively exciting, but at 10 points that's better than just about most other things at that kind of points cost. And then of course their really amazing ability is the one where they get to slow a whole bunch of enemy infantry down. Literally every enemy infantry unit that gets hit by one of these gets to have -2 to their move, advance and charge, and that's utterly crippling for melee armies that want to try and get forward into combat, or even just enemy infantry that desperately need to get to objectives in the midfield. This feels like one of the special rules that most of the time Games Workshop has said one unit hit by one of the attacks can get this, rather than each enemy infantry unit hit by this gets the debuff. It is pretty ludicrous that a single 50-point unit of these could fire 5 different ways and basically slow down half an enemy army. Overall, they just seem to be perhaps one of the best counter-infantry units in the entire game of 40k. Between that, they seem just absolutely auto-include, and you could certainly run them in decent numbers if you wanted to. The main issue, of course, is they don't really deal much damage to things like knights or tough vehicles and things. They're going to be far less relevant in that kind of matchup, but against the field, they're going to be relevant in enough games that they're well worth taking in decent numbers. Finally, last but not least in the top tier are the Biovores. 40 points each and available in units of 1 to 3. I feel like in general they're not a unit that you want to take in excess numbers, but just around about 1 to 3 of them, probably in individual models, seems a pretty excellent investment, and again could be a powerful tool to stop the enemy army in its tracks. I'd say probably the most annoying use of these guys is to get first turn. Hopefully your opponent doesn't have any units screening out the midboard, and then just lay down a few individual spore mines into the centre of the board. Spore mines have that rule where the enemy army can't advance within 6 inches of them, so it means that in the first turn your opponent won't be able to advance with any of their units, and it's often going to be pretty crippling when, say in the first turn, they'll often need to advance to get into the central objective markers, or just trying to move up the board with any of their elite melee units and set up an easier charge on turn 2. Laying down that curtain of spore mines if you get first turn could certainly have game-changing consequences. It certainly doesn't matter if the spore mines go on to deal any real damage or not. Beyond that, you could then decide to either lay down more spore mines or just switch to their decent enough indirect fire profile. Hitting on a 4+ with heavy means they should still get a decent amount of hits on the opponent, and strength 6, AP 2 and devastating wounds I think is actually fairly solid damage output for indirect fire. They're not generally going to be wiping out whole units unless you get very lucky with the 6s, but as with other indirect fire, just finishing off the last stragglers on hidden enemy units or gunning the last of an enemy infantry unit off an objective could be absolutely massive. Again, just being so cheap, I feel like there are hard units to pass up in your army. 40-point models that can lay down a curtain of very disruptive spore mines and then provide some useful indirect fire, as well as being somewhat annoying to try and deal with scattered around your deployment zone in hiding. So anyway, there we have it, a bit of a roundup of the strongest and weakest Tyranid units in Warhammer 40k 10th edition. Look forward to hearing your thoughts on the faction down in the comments below, and which of these units have been working for you or have you found a bit underwhelming. Looking forward to hearing all your thoughts. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I'll certainly be aiming to keep plenty of the tier list coming for the other factions in 40k over the next few weeks and months. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description below if you'd like to help support. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.